Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it, and I'm very happy to be here this morning. For those who have not heard of me, I've been blogging, and blogging isn't even a great word anymore because it's really a full website nowadays, but it's been doing what I've been doing since 2004, which is a long time now. And there are a lot of components to my blog. I enjoy doing it because there are so many different outlets and so many different ways I can talk about things. So I do like Jen said, I do some original analysis. I have some historical research on there. I really like relating things that happened over history with what's happening nowadays. I get into legal arguments, which is actually a very big deal with Israel. If you need to understand international law, a lot of the people that are saying things against Israel are saying it based on international law, and they are very often wrong. Lots of sarcasm. I use Google Translate to translate Arabic articles. I've gotten fairly good at it, and I have other people I can speak to make sure I get my translations right. But there's a lot of scoops that I get just from looking at the Arabic media. I make my own cartoons. We have our own videos. I have posters, infographics. I've had a number of scoops that some of them did make into the mainstream media. Most of them, unfortunately, didn't. But I have a lot of stories that you will not see anywhere else. So far, 23,000 posts over these 11 years. 2 million page hits a year on my blog itself directly, and many other people read it through email lists or through RSS feeds or other ways. 17,000 Twitter followers. I've been quoted in a number of places, CNN included, very often quoted in Allgemeiner and but Tablet, The Forward. I've been in a number of places. So the topic that we're speaking about today is speaking truth to power. This is a phrase that you hear often, especially in liberal circles. And the implication of the phrase, although again, the history of the phrase was actually, believe it or not, it was actually coined by a civil rights leader, Bayard Rustin, who was a very big supporter of Israel, just coincidentally. But it was popularized by the Quakers in the 1950s to push pacifism. But nowadays, the phrase is used by the media, and it's used by human rights organizations who try to position themselves as saying they are the lonely voices for the downtrodden, for of saying the truth against a world that's against the truth. But nowadays, and especially in the context of the Middle East, what I want to discuss today is where is the truth and where is the power? And we're going to start with Amnesty International. I've been spending a great deal of time over the past year speaking about Amnesty International, actually more than the past year, but I'm going to just use this one example that happened this past summer as emblematic of things that are going on that people do not really realize when they hear about something like Amnesty. Amnesty is it's considered a saintly organization. It's considered completely beyond reproach. So what happened was, last year, as everybody knows, there was a big war in Gaza. And there was a lot of publicity and a lot of very negative publicity for Israel as a result of this war. In the one-year anniversary of the war, Amnesty International decided to make their own web page. This is the first time they've ever done something like this, and certainly the last time they're ever going to do something like this for anybody except for Israel. The web page, and it's a very slick web page, by the way, they called it the Gaza Platform, in which they claimed to be documenting every single attack that Israel did against Gaza, not the other way. They didn't look at the rockets or anything like that, but every single attack Israel did, how many people were injured, how many people were killed, interactive, slick map, to be able, and they said, its purpose is to help push for accountability for war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law by Israel. They didn't say the words by Israel, but that's what they meant because this entire platform is only looking at Israeli attacks. As soon as they announced it, and as soon as I read the details, I saw that it was going to be a very slick, beautiful cover for complete garbage data. How do I know that? Is because they said what their sources were. Their sources were the Palestinian Commission for Human Rights, PCHR, the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, which is another Gaza-based human rights organization, and Amnesty itself. They said they're getting all their data from these three organizations. Now, during the war in Gaza, I would read the daily reports by PCHR. And the daily reports would say, as in the actual time of when it happened, within 24 hours, they'll say, Israel did this airstrike, or these number of airstrikes, these number of civilians were killed. And then, a week later or 2 weeks later, I would find that in the Hamas website or in an Islamic Jihad website, it would say, hey, here are the names of our martyrs that were killed, our soldiers, and it would be the same names as the people that they called civilians. Amnesty chose the initial data from PCHR and Al-Maizan, the one that was in that day, in order to determine who is a civilian, which is the data is completely wrong and provably wrong. So here's just one example, and again, I went through the platform quite a bit. But here's a screenshot. If you could, again, as I said, it's a slick website. It's a very nice piece of code. And on this page, you can see that it says from their totals, if you look at their totals, they said 1,989 people they documented that were killed, and 1,665 of them were civilians. Now, if you look at the UN, and the UN is hardly pro-Israel, the UN came up with their report earlier this year, and the number they came up with was 1,462 civilians out of more people killed. So instead of 84% people being killed of being civilian, the UN said it was 69%. That's a huge difference already. The UN is wrong too. The real number is closer to 50. The latest I've heard is maybe 52% civilian, which again, given how Gaza is set up, and given how Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all the other groups were purposefully building tunnels and setting up their rockets exactly where civilian structures were, that's a fairly good percentage. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But clearly, just initially, Amnesty was wrong. Just from looking at this, you can see, it's provable, you could see these numbers are wrong. As a matter of fact, and this is amazing that I'm praising the UN in comparison with Amnesty, the UN's numbers, as soon as the war was over, the UN's numbers were very close to this, because the UN was doing the same thing that Amnesty was doing. They were relying on these two human rights organizations, these two Palestinian human rights organizations, to say what their numbers were. But the UN actually revised it downward over the next few months. So the 200 that the UN said were actually militants and were actually terrorists, Amnesty never admitted. So here's some examples, and I'm sorry, you probably can't see these so specifically, but every day this summer, Amnesty, or almost every day, Amnesty would put out a tweet saying, 1 year ago today, Israel killed X number of civilians. As soon as they would tweet it, I would write back and say, here's what the target was. He was Islamic Jihad, or a terrorist lived in that house, or something else like that was going on. Here's what the real target was. They never acknowledged what I was saying. So for example, here, 8th of July, the first day, 6 civilians killed when an Israeli missile struck a family home. Even if you look at the Gaza platform, it'll admit that one of the Al-Maizan's notice said, oh, this was actually an Islamic Jihad leader was one of the ones killed. The other one said, no, they were all civilians. They chose the one that said they were all civilians. A big one that the Amnesty loved, saying, 9 Palestinian civilians were killed watching the World Cup in a local cafe. Every single one of those 9 people was a member of the Abu Rish brigades. Because again, I have a poster, that a martyrs poster from the Abu Rish brigades showing all of them as martyrs. One of them that Amnesty said is 13 years old is this person over here with the rocket launcher. He's obviously not 13 years old. So Amnesty took this initial bad information. It was proven wrong a year ago, and I've documented it. It was proven wrong a year ago, and I'm not the only one, because the Israeli government did, and there's also a great NGO called the Meir Ami Terrorism Center in Israel that documents these exhaustively. And clearly he's not a 13-year-old boy, and I knew that a year ago, and I reported a year ago. Amnesty still says today, you go to the Gaza platform, it still says it that. An ambulance in Rafah, August 1st, they said that Israeli warplanes bombarded an ambulance of the Ministry of Health. 3 medical workers were killed. All 3 of them were Islamic Jihad fighters. And again, I have the picture over there of all of the 3 of them from their martyr posters. Another one, it said 8 people were killed, including 2 children from an Israeli missile that hit a family home. And I said, well, one of those members happened to be a commander in the Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades. So nearly every example that Amnesty tweeted over the summer, I found that there was a military target. And this is important to know. The reason is because Amnesty tries to portray killing civilians inherently as being a war crime. And here the question is, what's the real international law regarding this over here? When is killing civilians a war crime? There are 2 cases in general that killing civilians are a war crime. One is if you're deliberately aiming at civilians. 2 is you're not aiming at civilians, but you know that the number of civilians that you're going to kill is going to be way out of proportion to the target, the value of the target that you're doing. Those two things would be war crimes. So, well, that first one that I mentioned is called the principle of distinction, that you have to distinguish between military and civilian targets. The second is called the principle of proportionality, that a reasonable military commander must take into account the value of the target, and based on that decide whether the civilian's being killed or whatever, which is unfortunate, but you have to win a war. So it's not that, like, international law and the laws of armed conflict do not anticipate no civilian casualties. They understand it, it's collateral damage, and every single war manual of every major nation on earth understands this and says this. So, as I said, to violate the principle of distinction, you have to have a deliberate decision from a military commander to aim at civilians. So when Amnesty is saying that, oh, look at these 6 civilians who were killed, and we've documented 6, 8, 2, 4, in all these different cases, therefore it must be a war crime because there are so many of them, but if in every one of those cases there's a valid military target, then calling it a war crime is slander, because it clearly isn't. The only question that they have remaining is, was it proportional? Was the target proportional? That, which I don't really talk about over here, but I'll briefly go over it. It's a difficult question of knowing what proportionality is. But I'll tell you one case in which you could pretty much extrapolate from that everything else. This happened during the prosecutor in Yugoslavia in a war crimes trial, looking at NATO. At one point, NATO hit a radio station. The radio station was used both for regular radio stations as well as for propaganda. 16 people were killed in that airstrike. The radio station was only down for a few hours. The prosecutor said, given how valuable that radio station was as far as being able to use it for the enemy war effort, 16 people is a lot, but it's certainly not disproportionate. And that's a couple of hours of a radio station going down. How do you compare that to a tunnel? How do you compare that to a missile silo? How do you compare that to anything that the Palestinians were setting up over there? It's like, that's an amazing thing. That's the prosecutor who said, I'm not even going to bother prosecuting this case because it's clearly not a war crime. So if you compare against that yardstick, then very little, unless you can't possibly prove that Israel was aiming at a real target, there's no way that they're war crimes, which means that Amnesty is really engaging in slander against Israel. This is a major thing, and it's not the first time they're doing this, and they do it all the time, and they know they're lying. Amnesty knows it, because I've tweeted to the specific researchers, and they definitely read their tweets. They ignore me. Fans of mine emailed to Amnesty and said, hey, look at this, here's the pictures of these people that are showing that you're saying is a civilian. I have a picture of them in military uniforms where, with RPGs, and they just answered, oh, we don't consider that a reliable enough source. I'm not expecting anybody to look at me as a reliable source. I expect people to follow my links because I prove everything that I write. I say, here's where you can see it. Here's the actual video of the Hamas person, giving his martyrs video, and here's where you can see it on the thing. So they say it's not a credible source. So they know they're lying. They know this very well. And just from the fact that there are a number of civilians, just that first slide I showed you, of the number of civilians, we know they're wrong. They know they're wrong against even the UN numbers, but yet they keep the Gaza platform up as it's still there today.
Is there any legal redress for such activity on their part?
As far as I know, no. I mean, it's not what are they doing? It's they're giving an opinion. It's not. I don't think slander. What are you going to do against it? I'm not aware of anything.
It is slander.
It is.
They do have a certain fiduciary responsibility as an NGO, but I don't know about it.
I would think so. It's something maybe Shurat Hadin might be able to answer that question. I don't know the answer to that. So it's very funny because Amnesty and Human Rights Watch love saying that Israel is acting with impunity. That's one of their favorite words is the word impunity. Israel can do whatever they want without any fear. Israel has great fear of what these people are saying. Israel has modified many times their own rules of engagement in war because of worries about how people are going to look at things. However, Israel is scrupulous in saying that everything we're doing is according to the laws of armed conflict. And you can read their reports, and they say, here's what it is, here's what the target was, here's why it was a valuable target. And they'll explain the whole thing in terms of international law. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the others, Oxfam and others, will just ignore it. And they say, it's just a whitewash. It's anything like that. If you ever read any articles about what goes behind Israel targeting something in Gaza, the amount of layers of of responsibility that has to go through it, a number of people that have to approve it, and the lawyers have to look at it every time before they make that decision. So nothing is happening just the way that, if you read Amnesty reports or Human Rights Watch reports, they'll make it sound like, oh, clearly, Israel was just very upset over something that happened and therefore they decided to bomb this for no reason. As if Israel is like a 5-year-old child that just was very upset and decided to lash out. It isn't that way. It's a modern professional army. That's not how armies act. And, which also brings up another fact, which is that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have no military experts on board. They don't have anybody. Military experts, almost every single one, looks at Israel and says, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're right. And they've toured Israel afterwards, they've written articles. It'd be very, very hard pressed to find a military expert that says Israel's doing anything against international law. And the people that determine whether you violate the principle of proportionality or the principle of distinction, according to the Red Cross, is a reasonable military commander. It's not Human Rights Watch, it's not the press, it's not the media, it's not even the president. It is a military commander, one that knows how wars are actually waged. So Amnesty is really the one acting with impunity. So why is this happening? And this is just, as I said, just one example among many NGOs. Bassam Eid is a very interesting person. He's a Palestinian human rights researcher. He used to work for B'Tselem. He'll criticize Israel, and usually his criticisms have some merit to them. But he also criticizes Palestinians, and he criticizes Palestinians more. In fact, he had to leave B'Tselem because he told them, B'Tselem, of course, is the Israeli human rights organization, he told them, hey, why don't we look at Palestinian human rights abuses? And they said, no, we don't want to do that. He really wanted to, because he's saying, this is crazy. We're spending all our time bashing Israel when there's far worse things happening by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, etc. So he started his own. But he said, if I want to establish an anti-Israel NGO, I promise you tomorrow I would get $500,000 from Sweden. That was just one example. He said, Sweden won't give me any money now because I'm looking at Palestinian stuff, but if I decided to start something against Israel, I would get $500,000. The money, there's an immense amount of money, especially from Europe, and not only, there's plenty from the United States, that are being poured into these non-governmental organizations specifically to bash Israel. It's an amazing amount of money. NGO Monitor, which is a site, if you're not familiar with, you should really look at. They track, there are over 250 very often well-funded NGOs that are biased against Israel, that they track themselves. There are a couple hundred within the territories themselves. And it's as I said, a self-feeding industry where the negative reports, if you're a member of an NGO in the Palestinian territories, and you're paid to write reports against Israel. If you're not writing these reports, you're not going to get your funding because the funders want to see these reports. So it just feeds on itself. And again, as I said, this is only the tip of the iceberg. This is only one example that I'm bringing from the Gaza platform. I've seen plenty other examples of bias from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, from Oxfam. There actually is there are fact-finding standards, something called the London Guidelines, that were set up to saying, if you were going to do fact-finding, here is a complete set of rules to show that you are not being biased. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and none of the others will agree to go by these guidelines. They have their own, often fairly opaque methods of being able to, of saying how they're doing their fact-finding. And the fact is, their researchers are very anti-Israel. Many of their researchers started off working for places like International Solidarity Movement or something like that, these known anti-Israel organizations, and then from there they went in to HRW or Amnesty. They're biased to begin with. What I think, for example, if you want them to be unbiased, I think that Amnesty or Human Rights Watch should just shuffle the playing cards. Say, okay, all our Middle East analysts should now go to China, all of the South American ones should go to Israel, now let's see what's going on. It's not going to happen because the whole reason these people are moving to the Middle East and want to be researchers for human rights is to bash Israel. That's their entire purpose. So, except in rare cases, the media will not look at this. You would think it's a scandal. If we have Amnesty International lying, proving lying, I could do 100% proof, I could show it, there's nobody that can say that I'm making this stuff up. The media is not interested. Almost never, and there's one example I can give you that's a counterexample, but almost never will the media mention anything. The only counterexample, which I was also involved with, this happened a number of years ago, 2006, 2007, I don't remember, there was a a researcher for Human Rights Watch named Mark Garlasco. And somebody emailed me and said, you should check out these web pages. This guy really is a fan of Nazi memorabilia. And I looked at them, and yeah, this guy was crazy. He loved collecting, and had some of the stuff he was saying, ooh, this is so neat, this SS uniform, it makes my blood run cold, and stuff like that. There was a picture of him with his daughter as he's like in one of these, at like a little conference where people are, it's like, what? What's going on over here? So Mark Garlasco actually was as I said, he was a big researcher on, and he loved his Nazi memorabilia, and people pointed out, hey, this is a little bit strange that a human rights researcher should be so into Nazis. The ironic thing is, okay, after a number of months, and it did hit the media, and there was pressure, and eventually Human Rights Watch, got rid of Mark Garlasco. The ironic thing is, he probably was one of the better Human Rights Watch researchers out of all of them. He was the actually one that was a little bit more fair to Israel than others. He had a little bit. They loved him because he had a little bit of military experience. He was like at a desk job at the Pentagon, so they thought, oh, he knows something, and he would actually go and say, well, clearly this explosive came from from Israeli munition and not from a mine or something. He's like, what? He had no expertise whatsoever, but it was very interesting. So nevertheless, for the media, will not say, for the most part, is not going to say anything bad about NGOs. And they're saintly, as I said, they're above reproach. And there's also one other big difference between the media and NGOs is that the media will, if you point out to them in the right way, they're going to correct their mistakes. NGOs don't. So let's go talk about the media now. Memes is like a very important way of understanding how, not just the media, but it's an interesting way of looking how the media thinks. A meme, and people have heard about these things on the internet, a meme is my quote is, an idea, a behavior, or style that spreads from person to person within a culture. So reporters, as well as politicians, are very susceptible to these memes. And once they hear a meme, and they say, oh, here's how Israel is, and here's how the Palestinians are, then they like, okay, that's how it is, and they're going to keep things that way, and they will fight against any stories that violate their essentially political correctness or their memes. And it's easier for them to use the boilerplate language in every article instead of having to explain, because it's a lot of explanation saying, okay, Jerusalem and the West Bank and legal and this and that. So they want to keep that all into one sentence so they can write the rest of their articles. So there are a number of anti-Israel memes that have become conventional wisdom, and I'm not going to go to every one of these, but some of them are very interesting. Like, this one's not as popular as it was a couple years ago, but solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the key to solving all Middle East issues, which was known as linkage. Solve that, then everything will be okay. Now with ISIS and with Syria, you're not hearing that as much as you did a few years ago. But a few years ago, that was the meme. And there were major papers that were written saying, oh, if only Israel would just give up some more land, that's all they need to do, everything would be great. Bibi is a right-wing extremist, and Israel's turning more hawkish. This is again accepted as fact today, that Netanyahu is super right-wing, and his government is incredibly right-wing, and that Israel is turning more hawkish than it was before. If you look at the facts, this is not true at all. First of all, there's a speech that Yitzhak Rabin made about a month before he was assassinated, in which he described his vision of what peace is going to look like. He never said the words Palestinian state. In fact, he said explicitly, I want Palestinians to have less than a state. He never would have given up Jerusalem. He certainly wanted to keep Israeli presence in the Jordan Valley and in other places. He said that his position was to the right of what Netanyahu's position is today. And this is Yitzhak Rabin, Nobel Prize winner, saint. John Kerry talked about him yesterday at length, saying how wonderful he was and how great we would have peace if only he would have been still the prime minister. It's not true. So according to his own words, whether he's saying if anybody could read his mind, I have no idea, but it's certainly not true. And is Israel turning more hawkish? Not really, because Israelis still accept a two-state solution, something they would not have thought about in the 1990s. There's another one. A Palestinian state cannot be created without Jerusalem. Why? Why? Could somebody explain to me why Jerusalem is inherent? Is like they cannot have a state. Israel accepted a state in, even before in the partition plan, in which they would have nothing. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city, and Israel accepted a state in which they didn't have the old city before 1967. Clearly, Jerusalem's holy, but the Palestinians, they can't stay in Ramallah. It's the whole reason of the Palestinians wanting to insist on Jerusalem is in order to take it away from Israel, not because they need it, because they want Israel not to have it. Palestinians aren't serious about the right of return is another meme, because you mentioned that, and you talk that to politicians, they say, right of return's not, don't worry, they don't really mean that. But if you listen to any of Mahmoud Abbas's speeches, he mentions right of return every time, along with Jerusalem, along with 1967 borders, exactly the same importance. And everybody just says, he doesn't really mean it. And then there are stories that don't get covered. It's a little bit more difficult to fault reporters for what they're not reporting. But if you can prove that it's newsworthy, and they still keep ignoring it, over time there's a pattern that exists, that comes out. For example, and I've documented this, over the past 20 years, actually 24 years, there has only been 3 new settlements approved by the Israeli government. In 23 years, 3 new settlements. They were illegal settlements that they went to the Supreme Court. In fact, Peace Now went to the Supreme Court of Israel saying, hey, you should get rid of these settlements because they're illegal. And the Supreme Court looked at them and they said, you know what, we're going to legalize them. So it wasn't even the government that did this. It was the Supreme Court that did it. With all of the building, even though there are lots more people, I'm not saying there aren't a lot more people living in the West Bank, a lot more Jews living in the West Bank, but the physical space that they're taking up is all within the existing settlement blocks, with some exceptions. Occasionally there's a little bit of an extension, but not much. The amount of actual space taken up by settlements in the West Bank is still about 1.7% or something like that, which is essentially the number it was 15 years ago. Maybe it was 1.6 then. I mean, really, really nothing has changed. But all over again, and John Kerry said it just last night in the Saban Center conference, or the Saban Forum. He said, Israel keeps on increasing the settlements. Soon there's going to be no chance for a 2-state solution. They keep growing and growing, and of course, where are they growing? They aren't. It's complete garbage, but it's accepted as truth, not just by the media, but by the current administration. The bitter feuds between Hamas and Fatah, you don't hear much about it. When they were throwing each other off of buildings, there was a little bit, but that was back in 2006. But you don't hear too much about that nowadays. It still goes on. They still imprison each other. Mahmoud Abbas regularly lies and makes insane statements that the media just lets him get away with. And it's unbelievable. He has said that Israel raises wild pigs in order to attack Palestinian farms. He says this in speeches. He believes this. He says that he regularly praises terrorists, like all the time. They, and it's just, and these are suicide bombers, the old ones that he says, he's against violence, but he'll praise them and his martyrs up and down. And something which I think I say somewhere else, but I'll mention it now. Last week, he was at the climate conference in Paris. He spent the entire time in the climate conference talking about Israel is destroying our ecology. They're destroying our trees, they're destroying. The entire point of him being there was saying, we're going to use this as an excuse to bash Israel, which is what he does at every conference he goes to. It's like, and it's like everybody ignored it. The press said, okay, fine, that's what he does, no big deal. But if a purported head of state is using, a climate conference is important, ecology is important, the environment's important, and he's trying to use it to politicize his stance against Israel, shouldn't somebody mention, hey, this is a little bit weird. Let's shut this guy up. But the media doesn't mention that. The Palestinians want a 2-state solution. You'll find polls every once in a while. They'll say, look, they really want a 2-state solution. But the polls aren't necessarily asking the correct questions. There was a great poll that was done by the Israel Project a few years ago, and I believe it's been replicated at least once since then, in which they asked the same question, are you interested in a 2-state solution? They go, yes. They say, is the purpose of the 2-state solution as a stage in order to be able to use Palestine to be able to eventually destroy all of Israel? And they go, oh yeah, that's what it's for. That's the reason we want a 2-state solution. It's because we need part of the land now, and eventually we're going to take over the whole thing. They're not saying we want to live in peace with Israel. This is exactly what Arafat's plan was when he came up with, back in the 70s, he said, here's what we're going to be doing to destroy Israel in stages. We grab whatever land we can, and then we're going to start getting more. And this is what the people believe, but nobody asks them that question. The Likud-led government, this right-wing Israeli government, has spent tens of millions of dollars to help Arabs, Arab cities, Arab education, Arab schools, in East Jerusalem as well as Arab communities. As a matter of fact, during the elections this past year, the one town, it was a village, a small village, but one town that gave the highest percentage of its votes to Likud was an Arab village. Because, and reporters went to it, Israeli, only in Hebrew, of course, because you're not going to see this in English, except in some blogs. But they said, why did you vote for it? He says, we complained because we needed, we didn't have an infrastructure, we didn't have roads, we didn't have a sewage system, and now they gave it to us. The Likud government gave it to us, so we're very happy. But you don't hear about stuff like this. The 1967 lines are always called the borders, especially in Europe. They'll say, oh, Israel should never be across the 1967 borders. There were never borders. There were 1949 armistice lines. They happened to be where the Israeli army ended in 1949 when the ceasefire was done. It's completely arbitrary. It was not done for any logical reason. To say that they're borders is a complete lie. It was never meant to be permanent. Never. And even like the UN Resolution 242, the famous one, it says that we're not expecting the borders to say, we said the sort of borders have to be secure for Israel. It doesn't say that these have to be occupied lines, that they're all 100% occupied. It was always assumed that there's going to be negotiations as far as whatever the line would be between Israel and Jordan at the time. Now everybody's assuming it's between Israel and something called Palestine. There's the hate and anti-Semitism being taught in Arab schools is another topic that just is not mentioned. And it's constant, and not just schools from the PA, and not just schools from Hamas, but UNRWA. From the UN, I've documented this. I've spent a lot of time, and I don't want to get too off on that topic because I've spent a lot of time on the UNRWA, the United Nations organization. But I've shown that in the schools themselves, and that they would remove it as soon as I show it, as soon as I point it out. But for example, at least in 2 schools, there was a cleanliness initiative. And if you looked on the websites, it said, you should really clean up the school because you don't want to be like the Jews who are dirty. That's what it said, and this is on their website. Again, I pointed out, UNRWA took it down, they're very embarrassed. They won't say it out loud, they won't admit it, that they did this. This has happened more than once. The Arab discrimination against Palestinians in Lebanon is the worst. Lebanon, there are literally laws, even though they won't say exactly the word Palestinians, but there are laws that limit where Palestinians can live, how they can, whether they can build their houses or not, and the answer is no, and what jobs they could have. They don't call it against Palestinians. They say, against non-residents or whatever it is, but they won't give them citizenship. So it's really meant to be against Palestinians. But all Arab nations have laws that say, we'll allow other Arabs to be naturalized citizens, but not Palestinians. And this came from the Arab League in the 1950s. They said, here's what we need to do in order to keep Palestinian nationality, in order to keep them cohesive. So it's for their own good that they should not become citizens. When Palestinians want to become, do Palestinians want to become citizens? If you look at old UNRWA reports, they say, no, they don't want to become. There have been a couple loopholes over time. Once in Egypt a few years ago, in which they decided that not only Egyptian fathers, but Egyptian mothers and Palestinian fathers could become, also the kids can still become Egyptian citizens. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza applied for Egyptian citizenship. In the late 1990s, the same sort of thing happened in Lebanon. There was a little loophole that opened, and tens of thousands of Palestinians applied to become citizens of Lebanon. And also you don't hear about threats to reporters by Hamas and the PA, and the intimidation that they do. Also with newspapers, there's a myth of even-handedness. And there's also, it's even beyond even-handedness, because people love the idea of David and Goliath. This picture I have from Newsweek, which was really disgusting, pointed out there was a suicide bombing a number of years ago showing an Arab woman and an Israeli young woman that was killed by her suicide bombing. And they're saying, oh, look, and they're trying to equate, oh, look at her life and look at her life. It's like, what? One's a murderer, and the other one's a victim. And and you're saying, oh, there's, they're like even. It's okay. There's 2 different narratives. No, that's not the way it is. If an Israeli leader misspeaks, like Bibi did a month or 2 ago, by saying that, by trying to imply that the Hajj, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was responsible for the Holocaust. He didn't really mean that, but he did say it, and the words were wrong. The media went crazy, saying, look, he's trying to, how terrible he's being a Holocaust denier, and all this other sort of stuff. But when Arab leaders say worse, like I said, for example, the climate conference I mentioned last week, nobody says anything. The Arab leaders say far worse things and far more inflammatory things, and it's just completely ignored. There's, and the media loves the idea of a weak David against a strong Goliath. And that's one of the brilliant moves from a propaganda viewpoint of what the Palestinians did. It used to be the Arab-Israeli conflict. Small Israel against big Arab world. But when the Arabs realized they can't destroy Israel after they tried a number of times, all of a sudden, after between 67 and 73, and a little bit afterwards, all of a sudden became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, the Arabs are now no more part of it. You know, they support, who cares? You know, okay, there's a few 100 million Arabs that support the Palestinians. That doesn't mean anything. You know, it's really the big Israel against little Palestine. And that meme has, over the years, become what everybody believes. And also, just again, to think about even-handedness, and it's just so untrue. But again, it's the thing that reporters don't look at. Last year, there was a horrific terrorist attack by Jews, in which they, three Jews essentially abducted and lynched a young Palestinian boy, and burned him to death. It was terrible. Israel, as a whole, everybody immediately came out condemning this. Nobody supported it, except maybe you could find a couple of idiots on Facebook or on YouTube that might have said something here and there. But nobody came out saying that these people were right. A few years ago, 2008, there was the Merkaz Harav massacre, in which a couple of Palestinians went into, actually one Palestinian went into a yeshiva, a high school, and started shooting kids, killed 9, mostly teenagers, mostly 15, 16 years old, or most of them. A poll that came afterwards showed 84% of the Palestinians supported killing Israeli teenagers. There's no comparison. But the media, they want to say it's even. Both sides have good guys, both sides have bad guys, this and that. It's not the way it is. Just because one's 90% or 95% good and the other one is 5% good doesn't mean you can compare the two as saying both sides have good, both sides have bad. But the media will not report this. Maybe it's because they're afraid of being labeled Islamophobic. I don't know. But it's insane. Last month, an 11-year-old boy, a Palestinian boy, and his 14-year-old cousin stabbed an Israeli on a bus. 11-year-old is too young to be prosecuted in Israel. So he's, I think he's still being held. I don't think they released him, but he was free to speak to the press. And he told police that they decided on their own that they wanted to be shaheeds, they wanted to be martyrs, and they wanted to kill Jews. They decided that. But I don't believe that's the worst part. That's bad. That's not the worst part. As I said, I look at Palestinian media. I'll look through Google Translate, I'll read them, I'll read the news, all the major newspapers every day. I've never once seen an article in any Palestinian newspaper that says, 11-year-olds that want to be martyrs, we have a problem. You would expect you would see that one person would speak up and say, hold on, what's going on over here? What's wrong with how we're raising our kids? What's wrong with our environment that we're lionizing these terrorists so much that the 11-year-olds want to be killed just for the chance of maybe stabbing a Jew? Nobody says that. You don't hear that. Again, reporters, you have to be a little bit more of a better reporter to be able to say, hey, what's missing than what they're reporting? But this is a huge thing that's missing. How can nobody report on this? How can it be that nobody is outraged or nobody's even uncomfortable, at least publicly, in Palestinian society to be able to write saying, hold on, okay, maybe I don't like Israel, maybe I think that they're occupying us, they're doing crimes, whatever, but we can't do this. Nobody says that. No matter what the crime is, the justification is, occupation, settlements. It could justify anything in retrospect. Ahead of time they'll say, no, we're really against violence. But after the violence happens, they go, what can you do? There's occupation. Is life really so terrible in Ramallah? You can see videos of what it looks like in Ramallah. People live fairly normal lives. In fact, Mahmoud Abbas has said explicitly in a Washington Post interview, I think it was in 2009, in which he said, you know what? He was very happy with the way that America was dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he was very happy with the pressure that Obama was doing in Israel. And he says, you know what? Things are okay for us. We can wait and see how things play out as the rest of the world pressures Israel. Things aren't bad for us right now. The life is okay. We can just hold off. If things are so terrible and so desperate, wouldn't they be a little bit more interested in trying to get to an agreement instead of less? And do I even need to talk about regular, ordinary, obvious media bias? Here are 3 headlines in recent months. Israel kills pregnant mother and her baby in revenge attacks. That happened in Gaza. It was, again, after Hamas shot some rockets towards Israel. Israel aimed at a rocket factory afterwards. This was an unfortunate accident. But this one makes it sound like, bloodthirsty Israel has decided to kill a pregnant woman and a baby in a revenge attack. Palestinians shot dead after Jerusalem attack kills 2. They're the ones that killed the two. Isn't that the story? You know, Israeli police officers killed 2 Palestinian men, if you look at the thing, after attacking officers with knives. But that's not in the headline. And that's the New York Times, the other one's BBC. Now, there's some unwritten memes that are really bigoted if you think about them. And that's the real irony of all of this, is that people who claim to be pro-Palestinian are the ones that are treating Palestinians as infants, or as less than adults, or less than human even. Because the reason, that's the only thing that makes sense of why you don't see the coverage you should be seeing, is because the assumption is that Palestinians are irrational people who have to be coddled, or else they're going to go crazy. They're your crazy uncle on the 4th of July that you just sort of say, okay, say whatever you want to say. I don't, we don't want to get him to get off because he's going to do something crazy. Israel has normal Westerners. You could talk to them like normal people. You could say, listen, you know they're crazy. Just give up a little bit more. You're rational. But nobody is treating the Palestinians as rational adults that can take responsibility for their own actions. If you would treat them that way, they would be forced to act that way. But because the media and because other governments are looking at Palestinians as being little kids who have no ability to restrain themselves, then they're acting like that. Now let's talk about social media. The good news about social media is that the news is unfiltered. You can actually see real news. The bad news is, of course, the lies are unfiltered too. And there's a lot more lies out there if you're looking at social media. Again, this applies to mainstream media, but not as bad as with social media. Newsmakers and NGO members are not as careful with what they say on Twitter, which is very interesting. From my perspective, it's a lot of fun because you can get people to say things that they don't necessarily want to have in a newspaper. They want to, when they write their articles, it's vetted, their editors, their layers, they want to make sure that nobody says anything really, really egregious. But when they're on Twitter, there's no filtering. So sometimes people will say stuff that they end up regretting, and sometimes that ends up becoming a news item. So for example, a number of months ago, there was a CNN reporter named Jim Clancy who just started, and again, almost certainly he was drunk. I mean, that's pretty much what our consensus is that he was drunk. But he started like talking about, people. He was talking about the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but he was claiming that they weren't anti-Muslim. They didn't say anything anti-Muslim, and people were pointing out to him, well, yeah, they, look at some of their cartoons. Some of them were pretty disparaging towards Muhammad, and he just said, well, that's Hasbara. Like, what? What do you even get to that from? How does Hasbara come into that? And then he just said, and then he doubled down. And he started saying, well, you with your settlements and occupation. I was like, what are you talking about? And eventually, he just kept going. And he said, this is my Friday night, even though it was like a Thursday night. But apparently, that was his last night for his week, for how his week worked. His Friday night. So clearly, he was like drinking or something like that. He was doing this. And that's the last we heard of him for about a week until CNN got rid of him. But it's interesting because, on Twitter, people will say stupid things. And that sometimes shows what they really think. The good part really about social media, Facebook and Twitter especially, is that it's possible for you to directly speak with newsmakers as well as reporters and officials. You can ask them questions and very often they'll answer as long as you do it nicely. Other things, okay, forget the headlines I got wrong over here, but nevertheless, some news is unfiltered. You get the news much faster with social media, which is very nice. I duplicated this slide, my mistake. I really should have deleted the other slide. The other bad part about the social media is that there's bullying and threats. Which is irritating. There's trolling, people that just go out there just in order to get a rise out of people. It can be a huge waste of time. Obviously, it sucks a lot of time out of you to spend a lot of time on things. But then again, I say so is TV. So it's hard to get heard because there is so much out there. And extremism is what draws the eyeballs. It's difficult to get a large audience if you're reasonably moderate. It can happen. Of course, cute pictures of cats also draw eyeballs. So, who should speak truth to power? What's the answer when we talk about what is about speaking truth to power? And the answer is you should. This is really up to you. My job, as I see it, is I generate content. I generate arguments. I generate things that people don't see otherwise. But I don't have the time besides that to, especially since I'm being anonymous, I can't just go and write to all of the officials that are necessary, all of the media that's necessary, and say, hey, what's going on over here, and go a little bit further. You can. You're a concerned citizen. You can actually do this. Much of the real power still is with the opinion makers in the old media. So like, for whatever reason, Thomas Friedman, his columns are very often nonsensical, but he is considered, the fantastic authority, and he's hugely influential, no matter what he says. I just saw, and I don't know, I can't really report this as 100% true, but somebody was complaining to the New York Times that they didn't publish all of his comments. And they answered back, they said, well, we have thousands of comments and you have to answer within the first 4 hours, and there's a few other factors. However, the authors also get to decide what gets commented on. Like, well, hold on. The authors of the article can decide to censor what people's criticism in the New York Times? That's a huge story. If it's true, I have to verify this. I can't say this 100%. But it's like, what? But that's what they wrote. Blogs and new media outlets can too often preach to the choir. There are a lot of outlets out there, and because there's so many different places to get news, people end up gravitating towards things that already agree with their viewpoint. So there's echo chambers, both on the right and the left, and too often people end up preaching to the choir, but still it's source material. But the sides are so polarized, they're not even speaking the same language, but you can make the difference. Learn the subjects well. I think hopefully my blog is a good place. There are other great places to go, Camera, Honest Reporting, UK Media Watch, NGO Monitor I mentioned. Learn how to answer the other side. Learn what the other side's arguments are. Know your stuff, but know the other side's arguments too, so you can be ahead of them. Cultivate relationships. Whether it's a local reporter, whether it's somebody else, you just, be nice to them, start talking with them on Twitter, start asking questions back and forth, set up a relationship so when the time comes that you have to ask them, hey, why did you say this? Or maybe you have a story over here, or maybe you should cover this, you have a little bit more of a shot at it. Choose the appropriate venues for posting your opinions. Too many places you're just, it's so easy to be sucked into a debate, and then you're arguing with some idiot on the other side, and it doesn't matter because you're not going to convince him and nobody else cares. So you can't waste your time with that. There's a lot more of the idiots than there are of us. So you really have to, choose your arguments well and choose where you're going to do it right well. Like an example I like to give, for example, is the Amazon book reviews. Hopefully you read the book, but if you read a book and you have a good book review, that stuff stays there forever. It's not going to scroll off. And it's going to make an opinion. It's going to make a difference about whether people buy the book or not, if you write a good review. So that's like a good place to put things. Also, don't accept a false framework, and which is a huge thing to do. Very often the other side sets what the framework of the argument is. And when I say that, I mean that they will say, there were very few Jews in Palestine. Balfour Declaration, Britain decided for whatever reason to give Jews a homeland against the wishes of the existing Palestinian population. And now Jews essentially took over because they really weren't residents. If you start the framework at 1900, then yeah, it sure looks like the Jews just took over a land for no reason. But that's not the framework. The framework was, this was the Jewish land way before that. This was our land. This is the land that we've been talking about, the land we've been crying for, the land that we cry every year over Tisha B'Av, the land, Jerusalem is in all our prayers. This is our land, and we've never lost that attachment to the land. And thank God we have a chance of getting back there. When we had our chance, we ran back as soon as we could get our chance to move back there. That's the framework. If you start history in the year 1900 or 1890, you lose the argument to begin with because they set the framework. You have to set the correct framework for the arguments. Here's a very tiny example for this too, just because I love bringing it up. What was the first day of the first Gaza war in the late 2008? Everybody will say it's the first day that Israel attacked. I believe it was like December 27th or something like that. I'm trying to remember the exact day. However, Hamas declared war on 2 days earlier. They called it Operation Oil Slick. They shot 70 rockets. They said, hey, we're starting our war now. Israel waited 2 days before responding, but you could hardly find that out nowadays. They had an operation name. They even called it, for the first week of the war, they kept calling it that, Operation Oil Slick, or Oil Stain, depending on who translated it. Their framework was, hey, this is our war that we started. Then when they saw that wasn't fruitful for them to be able to use that, then they went back to, oh, Israel was the aggressor against us. But the entire world says, oh, Israel started the war, even though Hamas was being quiet before that. No, Hamas started the war. But nobody talks about that because Hamas rockets are expected. Israel responses, that's aggression. And I mentioned before, like the one-state straw man. I'll mention this briefly over here anyway. This is, again, I mentioned John Kerry's talk yesterday at the Saban Forum. He spent about 6 minutes of his talk saying how terrible a one-state solution is going to be. Saying, look how awful it's going to be. Israel's going to have this population that they don't want under there. It's not going to be democratic, and it's going to be apartheid. He didn't use that word. But he's saying all this sort of stuff. And anyway, he spent 6 minutes talking about it. It's like, who in Israel seriously is talking about a one-state solution in which Israel is ruling over, millions of Arabs that don't want to be under their rule? Nobody's seriously talking about that. You'll find a couple people here and there, but nobody's seriously talking about it. Now, some of the things they talk about, if you're like a Meir Kahane fan, and you say, okay, kick the Arabs out, I'm not saying that we should do that, but nevertheless, even he's not saying, oh, we should keep these people under our control. The fact is, John Kerry was making his own straw man argument, in which he was saying that, either you accept the Palestinian insistence on 1967 lines, or you're going to have a one-state solution. And it's like, no, don't you remember that Israel offered peace, in 2000, in 2001, in 2008? All of those peace plans would have resulted in a Palestinian state where there's no demographic problem, where Israel would not have to worry about ruling over all of these Palestinians. Why is there no pressure on the Palestinian side? Why does Israel have to give up more when the Palestinians keep saying no? And the Palestinians are saying, hey, this is a great job for us. We can just keep saying no. Israel keeps offering more. And the Americans are saying, yes, you still have to offer more. And the Europeans say, yes, you still have to offer more. And it's like, why? This is, again, all of these are like these underlying assumptions that are being made. And they say, just yesterday, Kerry said this stuff. And it's like, why? Nobody's willing to stand up and challenge this. Other things you could do to help Israel on social media. If you see something good, whether it's from me or somebody else, retweet, repost it, spread it in new and different corners. So, okay, I put my stuff where I put it. My stuff might get on Twitter, but I don't have anything on Instagram. If you have an Instagram account and I have a picture, or somebody else has a cool picture, why don't you put that one up over there? There's so many other social, Pinterest, there's also these many places you could take videos that are on YouTube, and videos on YouTube are popular, but if you know how to do some video editing and you can cut it down to 20 seconds, you could put it and embed it into Twitter. More people are going to watch it on Twitter, because people, if there's a video on Twitter, there gets more eyeballs on it. If you know how to translate, if you know other languages, let's say you know French, and sometimes the French will have an angle on the conflict that especially now with the Paris attacks, sometimes there'll be some interesting editorials. Translate that, and other people will get to know about it they wouldn't know otherwise. It happens very often in Scandinavian countries too. What are you skilled at? Everything could be used. If you know how to draw, if you know how to make cartoons, if you know how to edit things, if you know how to sing and you want to tape yourself singing, people do this sort of stuff. If you're funny, you can make jokes. All of these things can help. You don't have to think about, oh, I have to fit into some sort of straitjacket in order to help Israel. You do what you love to do in order to be able to help Israel, because every single skill is useful. Every single skill is necessary. If you love history, research history, and you can report on that. You could say, and again, talk to me about it if you want to. If you have a cool angle, a cool story, thank God I have a good audience, and I could at least get stuff out there, or at least I know the people that might be interested in what you have to say. If you're good at research, if you love reading, the details of research reports, and I do it sometimes, and I find interesting stuff buried inside UN reports or whatever. If you like doing that, that's fine. Accounting. There are a lot of nonprofits out there that are anti-Israel. I'm not an accountant, but their Form 990s are up on the internet that you could look at. You could see where they're getting their major donations from, and you might be able to put together some interest. If you have a mindset to do that sort of thing, that might be a very, very valuable thing to do. I don't know if it's going to pan out, but it's something that's interesting. Programming. Websites, things like that. There's lots of things that could be done. Fundraising, certainly. Spying. If you're of that sort of type of person that wants to go into to listen to the meetings of the other side, you can learn a lot. People have done that, and good things came out of it. It doesn't have to only be in person, because you could also just join their groups and listen. Join their mailing list and see what they're saying. Interesting things can happen. You have to be careful about what you report, because you don't want to, you have to make something sure that what you report before you blow your cover is something that's really good. Drama, the best thing that ever happened for Israel is the book and the movie Exodus. The best thing that ever happened for Israel's reputation was that. There's not been an exodus since Exodus. We need stuff like that. You never know what's going to hit. You never know what's going to go viral. But stuff like that is, if you want to write a romance novel, great. Call a kavod to you, that's great. However, if you want to write a romance novel, it happens to be you have that strapping Israeli guy who's fighting terrorists and he's the romantic lead, that would be even better, because that gets into people's heads without having directly hitting them over the head with the pro-Israel message. And again, the other side does this sort of stuff. So every little bit helps. And the other side is doing a lot more than what we're talking about over here. As I said, they're much bigger. And of course, donation. We'll definitely take donations to me and to your other favorite pro-Israel advocates. One other thing that actually came up this morning, so I'm going to end with this, but it's, and I don't want to go over too long, but this is, I'll just describe it. This is just, at the moment, as of 15 minutes ago, this was the top story on my website. But but this was actually huge. I mentioned it a couple weeks ago, but it got really worse. I saw an article, probably the most virulent Jew-hating article I've ever seen in the Arab media. I've seen anti-Semitism, I've seen the blood libel, I've seen like that, but this one was a guy that was saying, the whole reason that Jews are in Palestine is for us to be able to slaughter them after they pay the jizya tax. Very interesting that he said that. That we're going to end up slaughtering them. And there are, the ancient Zionist terrorists wrote the Torah. I mean, just ridiculous, ridiculous stuff. This guy is the head of an NGO. The NGO is called the Palestinian Commission for Refugees. I wrote about it a couple of weeks ago when he wrote another anti-Israel article. This one's even worse. This NGO is funded, or has been funded in the past, from National Endowment for Democracy, USAID. It's supported, I'm not sure about funded, but certainly supported by the Anna Lindh Foundation, which is a huge German NGO. And there was one other, the UN Development Program also, all gave money over time to this organization. The president, and this is on their Facebook, on their official Facebook page, they'll point to these articles, these anti-Semitic articles by their president. Here's what you can do. If you want to do something concrete today, and this will, I guarantee, make a difference, write to those organizations. Write to the NED, write to Anna Lindh, write to the other ones and say, why are you giving money to an organization where the head is so proudly an anti-Semite? And he's done this consistently. I found a couple dozen articles that this guy wrote. I'm saying, you do this. I can't do this. If they get even 10 letters, let alone the 50 of the people that are in this room, if they get 10 letters, they're going to already go into panic mode, and they're going to have to say, okay, we have to do something about this. But you can't just let up. You can't just let them off the hook when they say, oh, we haven't given them money for 5 years, don't worry about it. No, say, you've given them money, you're already associated with them, and you have influence over them. If you care about peace, don't just wash your hands of it. You should go to them and say, hey, fire this guy, or we're going to publicize it. Fire this guy, or we're going to go, we're going to make a big deal over this, because we do care about peace. They don't, okay? These foundations don't, but they say they do. You have to hold their feet to the fire so they can hold the other people's feet to the fire. Because you're not going to write to the Palestinian NGO, they're not going to care about you. But they care about their money. They care about their funding. And this is something, I can't do this, but if everybody goes home today and writes these letters, again, it's in my blog from today, looks them up, I give the links to where the contact information is. So write to them politely and say, I just found out that you have been associated with, you have funded in the past, whatever, $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 for this organization. The head of the organization proudly, and the organization's Facebook page proudly is espousing anti-Semitism. What are you going to do about this? And don't let them off the hook. You have to be polite. You don't just, don't start saying you're anti-Semite. Don't do anything like that. You have to be polite, but you do this. It will make a difference. Write back to me with what their responses are, so I can publicize their responses. Because if they write back, it's public record. It's not like they're writing you a private information. When a foundation or something like this writes you back, it's public, because their PR guys do it. If 10 of you write, 20 of them write, then they're going to start giving you a forum letter. They're going to have a little meeting, and they're going to have a war room, and they're going to say, okay, this is a bigger deal than we thought. Let's come up and craft a good response. And then we can respond to their response. But this is important, because this can snowball up. And this is the sort of thing that can hit the media. And I'm saying this from experience because a few years ago, the exact same thing happened, in which, this is a little bit more direct, but there was an organization, or there still is an NGO called MIFTA, which was headed by Hanan Ashrawi. And in Arabic, they put out an article saying that the Jews, their matzah is made out of Christian blood or Palestinian blood, whichever one they said. I publicized that. They denied it. They said, no, it's not. We didn't really say it, blah, 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 blah. But eventually they had to apologize. And they said, well, it's really not our shot, but they still tried to weasel as much as they could out of it. But nevertheless, it actually made the headlines. It actually made it into the newspapers. It takes a while. But this is not, I mean, newspapers like the blood libel. This is not quite as good as the blood libel. This is pretty bad what this guy was saying. So, and again, it's a Palestinian organization that they meet NGOs. They met a Japanese NGO, a Malaysian NGO. They meet with people. This is something you can do that will guaranteed, almost guaranteed, have an effect. So if there's going to be one thing you do today, go to my blog, read this one thing, and write the letter. So that's what I got. Are there any questions?